recording started. There we go. So thank you everybody for joining this webinar. I hope you'll find it really useful. This is really definitely meant to be kind of laying the groundwork where we can have some discussion points as well, and hopefully it will really help you um, to have those discussions with people as well around kind of carbon footprints and these ideas about kind of different countries having different carbon footprints and trying to avoid this blame game so we can all start to work together to tackle the climate crisis. So, whose footprint is it anyway? Kind of the blurb for this was explaining that this is kind of meant to help with kind of a very basic but understanding of what is quite a complex subject, particularly around how data is gathered, how the stats are formed, what's taken into account, what isn't. And essentially, we're contextualizing the blame game, but we're trying to avoid the blame game or dispel myths of a blame game around the climate crisis. So today we're going to be covering carbon footprints. I'm sure a lot of you already understand the concept of a carbon footprint, but just kind of the exact definition of it and what it covers. Then we'll be looking at kind of collective humanity versus the top polluters. A question that I've come up with quite a lot, and maybe you guys have as well, is, oh, but we can do our bit, but what about China? So I'll look into that a little bit. I'll then look into concepts of things like overpopulation and immigration, where kind of there's this myth that we have too many people to sustain. Then look into why other countries are still expanding fossil fuels or using fossil fuels. And then we'll look into kind of the all-important history behind it because we can't view the climate crisis just as happening right now. It's kind of been building for centuries. And then it will literally be the question. It's not the answer, unfortunately. So who is to blame and who should tackle it as well? But hopefully that's what you will be able to kind of decide for yourself at the end of this webinar. So, what is a carbon footprint? It is officially a measure of the greenhouse gases released in the atmosphere due to human activities. This is both directly or indirectly. So, some of these icons I've got down here, it could be the pets you have, the food they eat, kind of, the leads or anything like that that you purchase for them, any kind of consumption around that. It can be the energy you use, the clothes you wear, the way you wash them, the food you eat, how we kind of stay clean, sanitation, all these kind of things, consumption. So these things we don't need to live, but we just like to have around us. Travel, energy, anything you can possibly think of that we essentially need to live, that is in some way linked to the carbon that we produce. I would recommend as well the Carbon Literacy Project. I'm sure some of you may already be carbon literacy trained, but it's really, really useful, very in-depth way to understand exactly what a carbon footprint is and what we as individuals can do to tackle our specific area as well. So you may have heard of scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions. So I just briefly wanted to touch on that. This is mostly used for organizations to look at their carbon footprints, but it is quite useful to think about just kind of in day-to-day life. So the 3 scopes categorize kind of the different ways that a carbon footprint is created. So scope 1 is the things that you will already kind of think about. So those direct emissions. So things like when you're driving a car or when you're heating your home, these kind of things that that kind of produce emissions. There's also scope 2 and scope 3, which are both indirect emissions. So these are things like indirect causes. So if you buy a product and the way that it's produced creates carbon, then that would be part of scope 2. Generation of electricity, all these kind of things where you're not literally releasing these gases into the air, but somebody else is kind of on your behalf. And then scope 3 as well, anything not covered by scope 1 or 2. Created in that value chain. So that's when you're looking at full life cycle things. So when something arrives at you, so I bought a hairbrush the other day, it's not just about kind of whilst I've got it, it's about how it was created and how it will eventually be disposed of as well. So that's what a carbon footprint is. So I was hoping you could join me on slido.com. Just interestingly, it's all anonymous, but just to find out, who do you think popularized personal carbon footprints? So if you could join that, I'll just give a minute or so for everyone to join and cast a vote. Hey, thank you for doing that. Yeah, we can't fool you guys. It was fossil fuel companies. So the concept of a carbon footprint was created by ecologists, but it was first popularized by BP, which was originally known as the first exploitation company. That was their actual name, just for some trivia there. So I'm just going to show you the kind of first advert that was seen with that. So I'll show you this 2003 advert and see what you think of it.
What size is your carbon footprint?
The carbon footprint, that I don't know.
Whatever it is, the whole population of the world, make that a very, very big number.
How much carbon I produce? Is that it?
You mean the effect that my living has on the earth in terms of the products I consume?
Yeah. So this was kind of the point when they started looking at things like personal carbon footprints. So the problem, a lot of kind of scholars are saying, is that the term of kind of a personal carbon footprint assumes that the climate crisis is caused by universal human nature rather than the actions of a minority of kind of colonialists, capitalists, patriarchs, fossil fuel CEOs. So we're going to go through in this webinar. I suppose I need to use the word blame because that was in the title of the webinar, but kind of where is all of this coming from? And there is a lot to pick through because it suits a lot of agendas, particularly for fossil fuel companies, for us to believe that it's just part of human nature to kind of destroy the planet where it really isn't. So the ideas that people might have when you start talking to them about their carbon footprints, they might think it's collective humanity to blame. In general, other people, so especially other companies, I'm doing my bit, I put my recycling out, but other people are what's causing this issue. But definitely not billionaires or fossil fuel CEOs because they're the good guys. So reporting historically, so this is, when people turn to the science to have a look at it, to kind of to see where these carbon emissions are coming from. Reporting historically has only ever been national, so that's kind of territorial within a specific country, and per capita, so the average emissions per person per year. So Carbon Majors released a report which I'd recommend looking up if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So they have data from 1854 onwards. And, historically we had this kind of national level only, but the report looks at corporations that consistently generate substantial profits from extraction and manufacture of the kind of products that are the biggest contributors to climate change. So this is kind of a new way of looking at carbon footprints. And you'll see throughout this webinar kind of the issues that can come with just kind of assigning blame to specific countries or even looking at carbon footprints from specific countries, particularly when corporations now are kind of so big that they're kind of responsible for more than a country at times as well. So fairness in carbon footprints right now. I won't tell you which one's fair. I'll let you make that decision yourself. So there are production-based carbon footprints. So this is looking at the emissions that are directly coming from each country. It's about national boundaries, and that's kind of how it's done. They're also known as territorial emissions. There is also the consumption-based footprint. So these consider how much you consume, so goods and services as well. So this doesn't count exports, so anything that's created and then exported for another country to use is taken off the carbon footprint. And it does include imports. So if a country imports lots of things, then that's included in the consumption-based footprint. And per capita, which I mentioned before, so the emissions, the average emissions per person per year in a specific country, they are based on production-based emissions. So that's based on what's directly emitted by each country, not taking into consideration what's being exported and what's being imported as well. I hope that's clear for everyone. Do unmute if not, because I'm aware it's a very kind of complex thing and it's difficult to run through quite quickly. So looking at these, so the blue line here is territorial, so that is the production-based emissions, and the red line is consumption-based emissions. So I've chosen a few countries that can sometimes be considered, you know, when they say, oh, well, what about what this country is doing? So if you look at the production-based, so what the country itself is actually producing, the emissions that are going into the air, you can see that it is quite high. However, when you look at the consumption-based emissions, you can actually see that when you take off the amount that is exported and include the stuff that is imported, it's actually quite a lot lower, particularly in places like Qatar and Bahrain. So the people who live in that country are actually using a lot less than the country itself is producing to export to other countries. If we switch that around to a few kind of countries that we know are quite high on consumption. The UK, as you can see consistently, our consumption-based emissions are way more than we can produce. It's the same with Europe. You can see it kind of crossed over in the early 90s, but now Europe in general consumes more than it produces. The same for the US and for Norway. So the issue with this is, you know, we're looking at other countries that are producing things, but clearly we are importing those things and they're kind of being produced for us to use. So it's not quite fair that it's counting as a part of another country's emissions when it's demand kind of created by us and by countries in this situation. And I just like to compare this. So I think China and India are perhaps the two countries that come up most when people say, oh, well, what about what this country is doing? You can see here that the lines are completely switched. So the US and the UK, the consumption-based emissions are higher than the territorial emissions. And with China and India, it's the opposite. So both China and India export more than they use as well. So back to this kind of question of who should we blame. So you would think that perhaps this doesn't happen anymore, but as recently as last summer, there was a greenwashing ad by Shell, which was banned. I remember actually seeing it myself when I was streaming things. So I was quite surprised to see that on here. So I'm just going to play this for you, and I just want you to consider kind of the facts that came out once the Advertising Standards Agency looked at this advert. So they said that it omitted material information, so the proportion of Shell's business that actually comprises of lower carbon energy products that should have been included. Shell's own sustainability report in 2021 disclosed that Shell, not Hell, I didn't do that on purpose, disclosed that Shell represented a large contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And the ASA also said that consumers would be interested in seeking out businesses that were making meaningful progress. So this advert could quite easily convince people that it was a business that was really kind of trying to make meaningful progress. So just things to consider whilst we watch this one.
In the UK, 1.4 million households use 100% renewable electricity from Shell.
Shell experts are working on a wind project that could power 6 million homes.
Nearly 1 in 5 new cars now plug in.
These chargers are popping up on our streets.
Shell aims to fit 50,000 nationwide by 2025. Don't even think about it.
And with more electric car charge points coming to Shell forecourts near you, the UK is ready for cleaner energy.
So you can see, very nice, very happy, everyone's sunny. It can really convince you that Shell is doing a lot in the kind of sustainability sector, a lot for renewable energy. But and you know, the facts that they say in the advert are not wrong. They weren't disproved by the ASA, but they definitely spoke about how it gives the idea that Shell is this kind of really kind of leading at the forefront of renewable energy, when it's actually a very, very small amount of their business and their profits that come from that. So it's always things to think about. There are things like PR and marketing. I don't know if anyone watched Mad Men, but that was all about kind of how, you know, at one point cigarettes were really good for you, and doctors said that it was good for your health, and it definitely wasn't bad for you. And they kind of look at behind the scenes at ways that they convince people that these companies are good companies. So it's always important to look out for things like PR and marketing, greenwashing, and climate denial, because they all go hand in hand. These kind of adverts lead to kind of the greenwashing of companies that aren't actually doing that much, or kind of actively negatively impacting the climate crisis. And this all leads to these ideas of things like climate denial. And they all feed into kind of what people think about when they think about responsibility and carbon footprints. So the next advert I'm going to show you is from Greenpeace, and I think it's quite a powerful one, particularly referencing adverts like this as well.
Big polluters cover up their dirty business by pretending to be green, but their scams have dangerous consequences. French oil giant Total claims they're committed to a clean energy future, but they recently bought rights permitting future oil drilling in pristine peatland forest of the Republic of Congo. The world needs to halve emissions over the next decade, so oil must stay in the ground. Total claims they can compensate for the damage caused by their oil by planting a 40,000 hectare tree farm elsewhere in Congo, which they say can soak up millions of tons of their climate pollution. But don't be fooled. Total's oil addiction threatens the world's largest tropical peatland, which stores an equivalent of 20 years of the USA's fossil fuel emissions. This is home to indigenous peoples and a vital wildlife refuge for lowland gorillas. And the tree farm? Well, Total wants to plant a fast-growing tree crop that isn't native to the natural savanna ecosystem. The wood from this intensive tree farm will feed the timber industry. The reality is that this scheme does nothing to end Total's oil addiction, which is fueling the climate and biodiversity crisis.
So I think you can see even from that advert, the music is different. All of these different things that make you feel different things. And do bear with me, because I'm not going to end this on, so we can't do anything. It's all the corporations. There's definitely stuff we can do. But it's really important to consider that when you're having these conversations with people, this is the kind of environment that people are forming their opinions in as well. Particularly, you know, when that Shell advert would have been, I mean, I saw it, I think, on a Channel 4 streaming service. It was on billboards in Bristol. It was on TV. It was on streaming services. And then this Greenpeace one is on YouTube. So it is, it's kind of about where you find the information as well. And all these things that you don't quite realize impact your thoughts around things like the climate crisis. But they do really have an impact. So I briefly want to go into some myth busting as well. So overpopulation and immigration are two things that obviously we know at the moment as well are really kind of political topics. Um, Perhaps more immigration than overpopulation, but they have very kind of similar ideas. The idea being that there are more people, there's more consumption, which means there's a larger carbon footprint for the country, which means that country has more negative impacts. And this comes from this really kind of archaic view of how people live, and that the issue again is just that it's human nature to consume and to destroy these things. And it's not the case. So more often than not, the most marginalized communities are blamed for the climate crisis, the people most in need. There's been a focus on overpopulation, mainly from kind of academic environmentalists. Just the idea that there are too many people, and that's why we're still heading kind of towards a climate crisis. So I wanted to bring up kind of specifically Niger. It has one of the highest population growth rates in the world. As you can see, it's kind of an increase of 3.7% in general. And that was what it was in 2023. And in the UK, the decrease is 0.8%. So you can see there's kind of a big difference in the population growth rate between the two. However, in less than one day, the average person in the UK has created the equivalent emissions of the average person in Niger in a whole year. You can see the per capita footprint change. Sorry, I've switched those the wrong way around. So in Niger, it's 0.1 metric tons, and in the UK, it's 4.7 metric tons per person per year. So you can see really kind of this change in population is not the issue, and we will come across this quite a lot when we're looking at different countries in detail. It's about the amount a person consumes. I'm sure you've all seen kind of this image that I think it's in the UK. We need something like 2 or 3 Earths to sustain the amount that we consume, whereas in a place like India, it's less than 1 Earth, which is ideally what we need. So it's all about kind of habits as well, and consumption. It's the idea that it's to do with overpopulation does come from kind of these kind of ancient, I say ancient, it's like 40 years ago, but what feels like really archaic colonial ideas, that humans are just kind of almost, it's like when you look at animals, and thinking that, oh well, there's too many animals in the ecosystem, so the weakest of them won't survive, or some of them will starve, and that's just nature. But that's not the case with kind of our consumption habits. It's definitely very kind of unbalanced at the moment. Just for information as well, so you'll know kind of in detail about the UK kind of imports and exports, very few exports, lots of imports. You may know less about Niger, so I had a quick look up about it. So it's Africa's most important uranium ore exporter, so 75% of the country's total exports go to uranium. Other exports are things like gold, onions, beans, and meat. Their main export partners are France, which takes 55% of the total exports. And as you can tell from the name, it used to be a French colony. The US, Switzerland, Nigeria, and Ghana. So that is where kind of Niger's exports come from. Something else to consider as well is that often countries with the highest population growth rates are the countries that are made poorer due to historical exploitation. And as I mentioned before, kind of these countries and the people in those countries have lower consumption rates and lower emissions per capita. So countries like the UK with very high per capita emissions, we are showing declining populations, which shows that the correlation between population growth and carbon emissions is very weak. The problem isn't too many people, it is overconsumption. So this myth can be very dangerous, because it leads to ideas of things like population control. It really links in with things like white supremacy, the erosion of rights, particularly reproductive rights. We've seen in the past kind of like forced sterilization of indigenous communities, just kind of these genocidal ideas, I suppose. And it's all about dehumanizing people. It shifts the blame from those people who are in power. Just kind of remember the Shell advert and about how Shell is really nice, and nothing ever bad happens with Shell. And the question, I suppose, is like, who do you think is responsible? Is it women of color in the global south who choose to have a family, or is it these corporations and kind of the top 1% that are continuously doing all of these things that kind of contribute to the climate crisis? So the next slide is it was difficult for me to put together. So it does kind of talk about things around kind of racism and this idea of population control as well. So just as a warning. So the idea of overpopulation came in around the 40s. So Garrett Hardin, most famous for the tragedy of the commons quote. So if you've ever heard anyone go, "Oh, it's the tragedy of the commons," the idea being, I mean, I could do a whole webinar on that, on how it's quite classist and saying, well, if you leave, a public space open for people to just use, they're going to ruin it. So it should be in private ownership. So it's that Garrett Harding, who kind of was around during this time and writing, particularly during kind of the 40s and 50s, who basically took the idea that it's kinder to let people die, essentially, and this idea that kind of overpopulation was going to ruin it for everyone. So kind of it's kind of, well, I'll just read out his quote. How can we help a foreign country escape overpopulation? Clearly, the worst thing we can do is send food. Atom bombs would be kinder, which is just horrendous. I hated looking this stuff up. And then also that was in an essay that he wrote about overpopulation, and then shortly followed a book by somebody called Ehrlich called The Population Bomb. And this book, it took about a year after it was published before it was really picked up. He went on a talk show, spoke about it, and people panicked. So you can see this article about it by Charles C. Mann, which is I would consider reading that as well. It talks about how it made dire predictions and triggered a wave of repression around the world, and we're still feeling the effects of that today. And I just wanted to kind of quote this part of the article to just show how it's all linked in to racism as well. So consider the opening scene of The Population Bomb. It describes a cab ride that Ehrlich and his family experienced in Delhi. In the ancient taxi, its seats hopping with fleas, they entered a crowded slum area. The streets seemed alive with people eating, people washing, people sleeping, people visiting, arguing and screaming. People thrust their hands through the taxi window, begging, people defecating and urinating, people clinging to buses, people herding animals. People, 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 people. Since that night, I've known the feel of overpopulation. The Ehrlichs took the cab ride in 1966. How many people lived in Delhi then? A bit more than 2.8 million, according to the UN. By comparison, the 1966 population of Paris was about 8 million. No matter how carefully one searches through the archives, it's not easy to find expressions of alarm about how the sorry, I can't do French, Elysees was alive with people. Instead, Paris in 1966 was an emblem of elegance and sophistication. So it's really showing you how these ideas of overpopulation, it's never about overpopulation in kind of what was considered more developed countries. It was always about these other countries who should take the blame for this and how people should step in. And you can really see how it links to kind of colonization. Oh, well, those countries need our help because they don't understand and they're making the situation worse. So this was a really kind of difficult part of it, but it feeds in today. And even when I was growing up, I heard, "Oh, overpopulation is the issue. The Earth can't possibly sustain the number of humans it has." But it all comes back from these kind of very kind of colonialist, racist ideas about overpopulation and immigration. So, sorry to hop onto something else. We don't have a lot of time for this webinar. So I want to talk briefly as well about China, because I think that comes up quite a lot, a kind of around, well, our emissions right now are way lower than China. So if China's not doing anything about it, then why aren't we doing? Why do we have to do something about it? So China itself does have the largest population in the world, and it does top emissions rankings from that production-based footprint. So you can see why people would just look up who has the biggest carbon footprint, and they would see China, and it would feel like there's nothing they can do. However, there are some really interesting stats when you take into account kind of the history, and I will go into that a little bit, and who is responsible for climate change in different areas. So I want you to, when you look at this, it's just kind of a graph that shows you over the years who's kind of producing the most emissions. And it was in 1980 that China became the main manufacturer of the world. So I can talk over this one because there's no sound on it. So you can see that the UK, the USA, and Russia were kind of in a race almost to produce the most emissions at one point. And this was kind of all during colonization. So you can see it's when this is including countries that the UK, in quotation marks, owned. And you'll see an interesting shift as soon as we hit, as well as countries gain independence, but then also as we hit 1980. So you can see suddenly China's jumping up the rankings. So I think that's quite interesting. So it shows kind of like, you know, own borders, controlled territories, um, and, you know, reallocated to colonial power. So it's history has a big part to play in who is responsible for the climate crisis and where we are now as well. Um, so with China, when you actually look at kind of the, as I mentioned before, kind of the consumption-based footprint and the per capita, people in China, because their population is so large as well, they do top emissions rankings, but when you look at it per capita, so again, that's per person per year, they go from the top of the rankings from number 1 down to number 12, and the UK does overtake them again. So although there are kind of, you know, lots more people in China, per person, they are consuming an awful lot less as well. So this is what it's difficult to kind of try and summarize, I suppose, when you're having a conversation with somebody. That China as well is, you know, it's the manufacturer of the world. And when you look at kind of the sheer amount of exports, if you were to look at the consumption-based footprint, it's much, much lower. So really, all of these things that are exported should be included in our carbon footprints or the carbon footprints of countries that take it. But at the moment, China is kind of being the scapegoat because when you look right at this at the data, it's looking at everything that's produced, regardless of what kind of goes into the country or what goes out of the country as well. So, another question, why are other places still using fossil fuels? So I could go into, and I probably will in a little bit, and go into kind of a big rant about kind of the colonial world and how it set the world up on this course. But I wanted to talk specifically about kind of debt in countries, and Pakistan is a really kind of good example to show how it is so difficult for other places still using fossil fuels. So in the 1970s, oil companies raised the prices of oil, and a lot of countries had to borrow money, including Pakistan, to be able to afford the high oil prices that were set by those oil companies and kind of the fossil fuel extractionists. In the 80s, Pakistan was pressured by the International Monetary Fund, so that's where they borrowed money from to increase VAT for all of its citizens, which is just passing the debt on to those already facing poverty. So the IMF didn't really care about, you know, the people and their kind of day-to-day lives, but the government itself were pressured to increase VAT and other taxes. The government was and is still forced to spend more on external debts than things like healthcare, energy, infrastructure, all of these things that you need for a thriving country, they're having to do on a much smaller budget than they would because they are being forced to spend more on external debts. Debts are passed through the generations at this point. It's kind of government after government is having to pay off these external debts. And debts are increased as more bailouts are required for aid. So I've just got like a short clip of the floods that happened in Pakistan in 2022, and I just want you to think kind of while we're looking at it, how we are expecting a country to, whilst it's dealing with these kind of things, to pay off debts, whilst also kind of, historically being poor from the colonization of the British Empire, where they took kind of their best people and they took all of their natural resources. And then, I mean, don't get me into partition. That will be a whole thing on its own. And essentially decimated the economy. And now they're trying to kind of keep up on all of these debts as well, whilst also dealing with these very kind of physical impacts of the climate crisis as well. So during this year in 2022, Pakistan's debts kind of just astronomically increased as well. We're talking kind of millions, billions of dollars. So even when aid is being given, it's being given not freely. It's being given kind of adding to the debt for all of this as well. These bailouts sound like it's money given freely, but it's not. It's always something that has to be paid back as well. Sorry, just going to the wrong page there. So, Pakistan is an example of this. However, there are 54 countries currently living in debt crisis, so this is being replicated across the world. Imagine having to pay to try and adapt an entire country to the climate crisis. So we're not even talking about renewables at this point. We're talking about things like sea defenses, and those floods in Pakistan were due to rain. So trying to tackle these different things that happen whilst also paying back a huge amount of debt, having to increase VAT for all of your citizens. It's just an impossible situation. Fossil fuels specifically can provide quick money to pay off debtors as needed. It is not a long-term solution, and it does eventually contribute to kind of more debt. But when debt is being kind of demanded to be repaid, then countries are having to find that money somehow. So fossil fuels at the moment are giving them kind of that leeway. So that's why they're using that. But without the cancellation of debts and wealth transfer in general, so the cancellation of debts really is kind of the basis of what they need. But really, we need some kind of wealth transfer around, reparations for stuff that's happened in the past, because, we are in a country that is very much thriving off the wealth of what was taken all those years ago, and those countries are still suffering. So wealth transfer really should be happening, or being considered at least. But without those things, how are they expected to fund the transition to renewable energy and resilient infrastructure? It's a really, really difficult thing, and I don't really understand how countries are expected to do that. So, when people say, "Oh, well, these countries are still relying on fossil fuels," this is essentially kind of the counter argument to that, which obviously asks a lot of questions, and it's complex and it's very difficult. And there's also a lot of countries who are worried to give reparations because they think it's going to be opening a door then to like all of these other countries that are going to want reparations, and then we won't be kind of on top or in power anymore. And I just wanted to kind of put these two maps here as well. So the first is a map of countries that were colonized kind of in 1945. I tried to choose kind of a time right in the middle when it was kind of at its worst. So you can see all of these countries were colonized, and then you can see on the right a map of countries who are currently in a debt crisis this year. So red is the countries that are considered in a debt crisis, and then orange is countries that are heading that way. So as you can see, very similar looking maps as well. It's quite hard to view the climate crisis without looking at colonization and that kind of historical exploitation and extraction of resources. So adding history into the mix, I've already kind of brought it in, but I just wanted to compare a couple of things. So Colonization, slavery, extracted and exploited people. It took people away from their homes and their families. It eradicated ways of life, eradicated economies. It did eradicate kind of physical things like forests as well, to make way for plantations, and it resulted in extreme profit and generational wealth. Slavery was abolished, and then suddenly governments had to consider, well, how are we going to make all this money? And it pretty much immediately switched from, well, when I say it switched from exploiting people, people are very much still exploited, but it switched from literally enslaving people to extracting and exploiting from nature in the same countries, because they were still territories that were owned by those countries. So they're still exploiting nature, taking people's homes away. They're eradicating ways of living and kind of subsistence farming and this kind of historical generational knowledge of ways to live from the land. They are still eradicating economies for profit, and there is still a huge amount of extreme profit and generational wealth coming from this. So I just want to play a very short part of this video to explain a little bit better than I can around how it's all linked.
Justice mean, and how did we get here in the first place? The pursuit of grossly unequal and carbon-intensive economic growth by governments goes back centuries. North American, European, and other industrialized economies built oppressive systems of colonialism, such as slavery and apartheid, where the extraction of resources at the expense of people of color, indigenous peoples, and the environment was fueled by the Industrial Revolution. This led to rapid movements in living standards in Europe and settler colonies. But in many other parts of the world, people paid a terrible price of mass-scale colonial violence and oppressions. Never mind the vast amount of fossil fuels extracted, centuries of deforestation has left land extra vulnerable to climate disasters. And this economic model is still prevalent today, driving global inequality and climate change. A study found that in 2015 alone, the North appropriated from the South 12 billion tons of raw material, 822 million hectares of land that's twice the size of India, 21 exajoules of energy that's 3 times the annual energy consumption of the United Kingdom, and 392 billion hours of labor, all worth $10.8 trillion, enough to end extreme poverty many times over.
So that explains it a little bit better. And I also just want to read an extract from the book It's Not That Radical by Michaela Loach. Would very recommend reading this. I'm aware kind of at this stage in the webinar as well, it can feel very hopeless, but Michaela's book is incredible at giving hope in ways that we can tackle the climate crisis as well. So I'd really recommend it. So she writes, there's a legacy of the British Empire in creating the climate crisis. The barbaric slave trade saw an estimated 13 million people captured and stolen for profit. Racism was created to justify the mass dehumanization of kidnapped African peoples, something we'll get into in more depth in the next chapter. After this horrendous practice was abolished, the elites of the British Empire searched for a new way to make money. Here began the extractivist fossil fuel economy. To fuel the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the Royal Niger Company colonized large swathes of Nigeria to farm palm oil to grease machinery, and in India, ancestral homes were bought and communities displaced so that the land could be exploited to extract dirty coal. Those who had lived off the land were now forced into exploitative wage labor in order to survive, as the land was destroyed and the environment poisoned by pollution. A staggering $45 trillion was drained from India to Britain during the tyrannical rule of the empire. The industrialization and so-called development of Britain relied upon the de-industrialization of India, in which raw materials were brought back to Britain and exported across the world to create profit held in British hands. So this is just showing how it is all linked. And when people are saying, well, you know, India is still reliant a lot on fossil fuels, all of the things that we've kind of explored today can all still be traced back to that idea of, you know, the only way that the UK can be a rich country is through kind of that exploitation. And I'm aware I'm saying that as a country. I'm aware kind of at the moment we are in a cost of living crisis, but I think everyone will agree that that is still kind of at the hands of these corporations and kind of the fossil fuel companies who are still showing record profits.
But it's
So, I just also briefly, I'm almost there, don't worry, guys. I know this is a heavy topic. Um, Wanted to talk about cumulative emissions. So this is another way that we can use the data and have a look at the data, to show kind of how this history is so important, to what we're doing, and why it is so important that we kind of, as the global north, I suppose we can say, um, are still benefiting from this, even though we're all switching to renewables and we're saying, well, we're doing great. We're still benefiting from that large history. So in 2022, this was showing kind of the amount of emissions released, by different countries. So you can see the US is still high, the UK is, China is much higher than the UK. However, if I use my magical PowerPoint skills to make this white thing disappear, then you can see just how much history has an impact on the amount of emissions that have been produced that has resulted, or contributed to the climate crisis, particularly the UK. That huge start. Um, so kind of you can see in 1810, the UK contributed to 96%, um, of the emissions, just purely based on kind of the amount of countries, that were colonized as well in the Industrial Revolution. All of these stats, I kind of mentioned it earlier on, but it's ourworldindata.org, and it has a huge amount of data on there, and it really lets you play around with data, to have a look at this, and it really helps show the impact of history, on that. So I'm aware that was a lot of information, to come over in, kind of around 45 minutes. If anybody wants to unmute and have a chat, or if you want to put in the chat box, any thoughts you have on that, I'm aware there will need to be some time for processing on this as well. But the questions that we kind of wanted to tackle, and like I said, I don't have the specific answer for this, but who is to blame and who should tackle it are two very different questions. Um, Having someone to blame is useful, but then that also helps to kind of absolve you of responsibility. So the point of this webinar is ways that you can kind of have conversations with people around all of these barriers to getting involved, getting active, and getting organized in the face of the climate crisis. Because what we really want to do is all kind of start working together. Sustainability is definitely kind of coming forward, and we're trying to get it included in education from kind of early years all the way up to adult learning. We're definitely seeing, as generations, kind of continue, that newer generations are really understanding the importance of the climate crisis, and particularly, I think kind of Gen Z, are classed, I think, as 2005 onwards, which is pretty much when, the internet became widely available. So suddenly you can see how someone's life is in another country, and you can kind of feel like a global citizen, so that you're part of, um, the whole world, and why we can't just say, oh, well, it's that country's fault, so why should I do anything? Or, oh, it's that country's fault, so they need to tackle it. Or even something like, we're in this awful situation and that country isn't doing anything, um, to help tackle it, because there's so many things to consider. There's kind of these backgrounds, there's historical, there's these ideas. It's kind of all tied in with these ideas of kind of white supremacy, and we should be telling other countries what to do, and why countries are rich and why countries are poor, why countries are in debt. It's a big old topic, to look at. So kind of in who should tackle it, what I would like you to come away from this webinar with is that we all should. And hopefully you feel somewhat empowered, to have those difficult conversations with people, and see why it's not just as simple as Googling carbon footprint of this country, or average carbon footprint of a person who lives in this country, and that being kind of the be all and end all. And then we're looking at kind of how we tackle it, and that is essentially with communities. I think behavior change is very, very important. I know that this webinar focused, a lot on kind of corporations, and the idea of this personal carbon footprint, kind of, has only been around for 20 years or so. But I think it's really important that we we have changes all around. So we are, campaigning to look at these big companies and corporations, and as well, not just looking at countries, but looking at corporations that can be causing the climate crisis. But also, our individual behaviours will make a huge difference because it will tackle that consumption-based footprint, which I think is, kind of the more accurate one. And just considering things. So, when we look at kind of China having the biggest emissions, it's not just that China is creating it. It's because if you look at companies like Amazon or Shein or Temu or anything like that, those are all creating the demand for that kind of huge amount of manufacturing as well. So I'm going to stop waffling now because I will keep just walking in circles. But hopefully, you feel kind of empowered with this information and hopefully a little bit hopeful. The next, we've got a whole webinar series, as you all know. The next one that I'm doing is in January, and it's kind of a pathway to hope. So it's building on this webinar, which was very much like, here's the data, here's the scary things, here's the sad topics. And the next one is how we can kind of have hope and how we can work towards kind of a brighter future where the climate crisis isn't quite so much of a crisis. But thank you everyone for attending today. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute. I'll get Eva to stop the recording now.